Hello, welcome to this screencast where we will be addressing blood, the components and the functions of the blood. So by the end of this, you should be able to identify and describe basic functions of the blood, be able to identify and describe physical and chemical characteristics of the blood, describe the composition of plasma, define what the hematocrit is, and talk briefly about the different cell types and the major functions of what is known as the formed elements, and then also be able to describe hemoglobin. In class, we'll work on some of the pathologies associated with blood here. So let's get started. Here is a graphic showing us removing a sample of blood, and when we just remove a sample of blood, this is known as whole blood. And whole blood, having some issues here. So this is whole blood, and that whole blood can be separated into different components. Right? And the way you separate them is using an instrument or device called a centrifuge that spins really quickly, and due to gravity, pardon me, due to gravity, the heavier elements of that blood go to the bottom, and the lighter ones go to the top, and you can see them separated out there. So we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But some basic functions of the blood is that it is the major transport medium of the body. It is the major extracellular fluid. That is, it's not inside of the cytoplasm, inside the cells. So it is the major extracellular fluid, and we are transporting things that have to do with the body's nutrition, with defense and healing. Defense and healing. Also transporting elements that are required or necessary for respiration, and any sort of waste products of that respiration, whether it be a metabolite, and a metabolite being an example of a metabolite would be something like urea, or CO2 gas. Okay. Another major function of the blood is that it transports hormones that are involved in regulating regulation of the different body's functions. And also, blood plays a role in temperature regulation. Temperature regulation as well. Some characteristics of blood chemically, well, just other characteristics and sort of kind of fun facts, is that blood is 8% of your body weight. Men typically have about 5.6 liters of blood, and women have about 4.5 liters in their body. So this is, of course, dependent on your size. The larger you are, the more blood you're going to have. The smaller you are, the less blood you have. Blood pH is finely tuned between 7.35 and 7.45. So blood is slightly basic here. Let's go back to talking about the separation of the blood into the different components. So when you separate them, again, the lighter ones go on the top, and the heavier things in there go on the bottom. The stuff that's lighter on the top is known as the plasma, and this is 55% of the blood. The stuff that's heavier on the bottom are the formed elements, namely cells, and that is 45%. So this 45% here represents what is known as the hematocrit, and this is the percentage of the blood that is formed elements or cells. More on those formed elements in a minute. Let's turn back to the plasma here. So the plasma has a few main constituents to it. One, it is mostly water, right? And that water is a solvent for carrying other substances and absorbs the heat. So the other substances would be things like the cells, like the metabolites, right, etc., like the hormones. Right. Two, there are salts, and those salts are dissolved in the water. Right. So these electrolytes, also known as ions here, so this is your sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium, magnesium, etc., right? These are playing a role in osmotic balance, right? pH buffering. Buffering means to maintain a specific pH. So we're going to those ions are going to play a role in maintaining the 7.35 to 7.45. Right? Regulation of membrane permeability, and we've been discussing this a lot in the nervous system and the special senses. When sodium ions move in or out of the cells, they're moving in or out of this the cells and the blood as well. The third major constituent here are these plasma proteins, and examples of them are albumin, fibrinogen, and then globulins. And we'll talk more about each of those in future screencasts. But suffice it to say that these plasma proteins, right, are dissolved again in the water, and so you wouldn't look at this plasma up here and be able to see this albumin protein, this fibrinogen, these globulins are going to be dissolved in there. And lastly then, just a whole bunch of other stuff that is transported by the blood here. So we were talking again before about glucose, right, fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins. These are all things for nutrition. Right. Waste products, we talked about that above. These urea, uric acid metabolites, right, respiratory gases, right, and of course hormones. Okay, so that is what's in the plasma. Going back to the cells, there are three main cell types, and they are erythrocytes, or red blood cells, the leukocytes, or white blood cells, the second type, and the third type are platelets, and the platelets are also referred to as thrombocytes. Thrombocytes. Okay. So erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes, the three different cell types. By far, the most numerous of the cells in the blood are the red blood cells. Their major role here is to transport oxygen, right, and transport carbon dioxide. The leukocytes are the next most popular here, and their main role is in defense and immunity. We have different subtypes of leukocytes here, granulocytes and agranulocytes. More on that in just a minute. And then lastly, the platelets here are very, very small, right, but are somewhere in between the level of the leukocytes and the erythrocytes here. And their main role is in clotting, right, helping the blood to clot, so that if and when you cut yourself or there's some sort of tissue damage, then those platelets, those thrombocytes, are playing a role in helping that. And we'll discuss those details in another screencast. So just quickly here, let's talk about the red blood cells. And the photomicrograph here shows you red blood cells in comparison to a white blood cell. So this is a red blood cell, and this one here is a white blood cell that stains more darkly. Now this red blood cell in this scanning electron micrograph right here, they look like these little puffy discs, and the color has been added to that electron micrograph there. But they're biconcave discs, these cells, biconcave discs. And so they sort of dip in here on this side, and then if you flipped it over, it's going to look the same there. So it's really thin in the center, so it's like one of those snow tubes that you might sit in, where this is the tubey part, and then this is where your butt would go on the snow tube. So when you look at it under the light microscope, you see that it's kind of whitish right here, and that's because it's so thin that so much of the light is shining through this part right there. Now, these red blood cells right here sort of are overlapping, right, and this one is sort of turned on its end, right, so the light is not shining right through there. So those are the red blood cells, the erythrocytes. Now, the interesting thing about these is that they are anucleated, right, which means that they're at a functional adult maturity here, there is no nucleus inside these cells. Right? As they're growing and dividing, they will have a nucleus, but at functional maturity, they are anucleated. And that is to make room for this molecule right here, which is hemoglobin. So this is a hemoglobin molecule. And the important part of this is this iron atom right here that's part of this heme group. And this is where oxygen is going to bind. Right? So this heme group and this iron, O2 binds right to that part right there. So the molecular structure right down here, here's the iron, right? And those either in chemistry, this is an oxidation, right? So we go from Fe2 plus to Fe3 plus when oxygen is bound to that, so it changes the oxidation state of it. And when it does so, it actually also changes the color. So when oxygen binds to this, it turns bright crimson red, right? So this hemoglobin molecule right here, this is the heme part, right? So this heme group is what this thing looks like. And then you have all this protein structure that's all around that. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 heme groups in each hemoglobin molecule. That hemoglobin there are several million copies of that hemoglobin molecule jammed into this red blood cell. So essentially the red blood cell is a bag of hemoglobin. So this diagram over here, you see that they're showing you the hemoglobin molecules, right? Oxygen from the lungs is going to go in. It's going to bind to that hemoglobin molecule and then be transported to the body and to the body cells. And when that reaches the cell that needs oxygen, that oxygen is unloaded, right, and goes into the cells for aerobic respiration. Okay. So there's a little bit about red blood cells, the erythrocytes, and then the leukocytes and the thrombocytes. So the leukocytes are varied. These are the white blood cells, and we can basically break them down into 2 subcategories here. These are the granulocytes because they look granular. There's little grains in them, right? And then these over here, the lymphocytes and the monocytes, are agranulocytes. They do not have little granules in them, right? Of these 5, so the one that we'll talk about probably the most are the lymphocytes, right? And these are will be your B cells and the T cells of the immune system, right? And we'll deal a little bit more in detail with the differences in those in class. Lastly, the thrombocytes or the platelets. These are small, normally inactive cells, which play roles in hemostasis, and this hemostasis is the fancy word for clotting, maintaining the blood inside of you there. Okay, so these platelets are really little teeny tiny small cells. They have little nuclei that will stain, right? And under the light microscope, they're really difficult to distinguish sometimes. So you have to be at a relatively high power, if not under oil, sometimes to really see them. Okay. So there is a quick introduction. This table here has a lot more information on it that we'll deal with over the course of the unit here. So again, at the end of this now, you should be able to now summarize and identify and describe basic functions of the blood, some physical chemical characteristics, what is in the plasma. There are 4 things in that plasma. What the hematocrit is defined as, being able to identify the major functions of the formed elements, right, what they are, and again, of course, a little bit about the hemoglobin molecule. Okay, like I said, in class we'll deal with the pathologies associated with blood. Thanks for listening.